The Yellow Vest protest over rising fuel prices took a violent turn in the French capital. The protesters, with their faces masked and some wielding metal bars and axes, rioted through the streets of Paris. A dozen vehicles were set ablaze and buildings were torched, unleashing the city's worst urban unrest in years. It's the third week of national arrest by the movement, named after the high visibility jackets that all motorists in France must carry in their vehicles, and the second consecutive weekend of violent disturbance in Paris. Between police and Yellow took a fiery turn. Police fired tear gas, stun grenades and water cannons near the Champs-Élysées Avenue. Even as clashes were reported from several places across the country, more than 100 people were injured in the clashes, while over 200 people were arrested in central Paris earlier this week. French president took a stance by saying that he was open to ideas about how the taxes could be applied, but that seems to have done nothing to claim things down as the French city continues to be on the boil. French President Emmanuel Macron said that the wave of violence and vandalism in Paris could not be justified in any way and had nothing to do with a peaceful expression of legitimate anger. Macron asserted that no cause justified attacks on police or pillaging stores and burning buildings. He said those who had carried out the violence merely sought to spread chaos. He said he would convene a meeting of senior ministers as soon as he returns to discuss how to respond. US President Donald Trump will be sending the Air Force One to pick up George H.W. Bush casket from the Texas and bring it to Washington, where the late president will lie in state in the Capitol starting Monday. Trump called it a special tribute, saying the late president deserves it very much and that he'll be greatly missed. A former President George H.W. Bush will be laid to rest on Thursday on grounds of his presidential library at Texas A&M University. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis paid tribute to late President George H.W. Bush, who also served for 8 years as U.S. Vice President during Ronald Reagan's two-term presidency, and earlier as head of the CIA. Speaking at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library for the annual Reagan National Defense Forum, Mattis remembered Bush as a true patriot who put others first. Mattis added, former U.S. President dedicated more than 4 decades of his life to public service and taught the lesson of how to live a life without regret. In tribute to former U.S. President George H.W. Bush, his photograph was projected on the Kuwait Towers. Alongside both the Kuwait and U.S. flags, Bush was the popular leader of a mighty coalition that dislodged Iraq from Kuwait and was turned out of the presidency after a single term. The Persian Gulf War, dubbed Operation Desert Storm, was his greatest mark on history. After Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, Bush quickly began building an international military coalition that included other Arab states. Russian President Vladimir Putin said it was regrettable he could not hold a full-scale meeting with US President Donald Trump at G20 summit in Buenos Aires. Putin also said he considered the incident with detained Ukrainian ships near the annexed Crimean Peninsula among the reasons why a pre-planned meeting with Trump was cancelled. However, Putin and Trump had a brief meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit on Friday. Putin said there was no pre-conditions for future bilateral talks. Trump's administration has accused Russia of non-compliance with the 31-year-old intermediate-range nuclear force treaty and has said it will pull out of the deal. As a result, Kremlin has, however, denied violating the pact. Russian President Vladimir Putin invited Chinese President Xi Jinping to the St. Petersburg Economic Forum next summer as the two met at the G20 in Buenos Aires. Putin and Xi warmly greeted each other, walking to the meeting room together and talking as they went. The St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is often called Russia's answer to the annual World Economic Forum in Davos. The event is held each year since 1997 to attract investors to the Russian economy and is set for June 6th to 8th. Russian president also met French President Emmanuel Macron on the fringes of G20 summit in Buenos Aires. Both leaders said they are glad to have an opportunity to meet. Macron said the situation in Syria and Ukraine were the topics to discuss at the meeting between two presidents. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that there was no discussion with Ukraine about the possible release of the Ukrainian sailors who were seized along with their ships by Russia last month. Russia is resisting international calls to release 3 Ukrainian naval ships that its border patrols fired on and seized in the strait near Russian-annexed Crimea last weekend. Moscow accused the 24 sailors of illegally crossing the Russian border. Putin also added that by imposing martial law, the Ukrainian president had divided the country. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said his country had stepped up security at vital infrastructure sites such as nuclear power stations and Black Sea ports in what the face of, he called, a Russian test of the world order. Poroshenko presented new and overhauled military aircraft, helicopters and drones to the Ukrainian army. Ukraine has introduced martial law in parts of the country for 30 days, and Poroshenko said that military reservists in those areas would practice mobilizing and that military factories would be changing the way they work too. Polish foreign minister has called for the European Union to impose new sanctions on Moscow after Russia seized 3 Ukrainian naval ships and took their crew. During a 2-day visit to Kiev, Polish foreign minister held meetings with his Ukrainian counterpart and later with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. The leaders took part in a commemoration ceremony for tens of thousands of victims at Joseph Stalin purchase in a wooded area on the outskirts of Kiev. Georgia's new president-elect described Russia as an unpredictable occupying power, taking a tough stance on Moscow after opponents back home criticized her for being soft on Russia during the campaign. Now, Salome has become the first woman to be elected Georgian president, and she said in an interview that negotiations with Russia would have no point until it recognizes that it is occupying to break away Georgian regions. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he made clear to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman that Canada would always stand up strongly for human rights and around the world. He said he took the opportunity to have a conversation with Saudi Crown Prince directly in which he discussed the diplomatic discord between Canada and Saudi Arabia that has continued since August. During a news conference just after the conclusion of the G20 summit, Trudeau also called on the US to lift all trade tariffs against his country, saying both Canada and the US have benefited for decades from free trade. Speaking at the press conference at G20, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan lamented that the issue of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi's killing was not a part of the official agenda. Erdogan added that the world would not be satisfied until all those responsible for the savage murder were brought to justice. The Turkish president also met US President Donald Trump and discussed, according to Erdogan, about the situation in Syria and its Turkish border. The Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan told Russian President Vladimir Putin he should hold another summit to discuss the situation in Syria's Idlib province, where the two countries are trying to create a sustainable demilitarized zone. Erdogan made the suggestion during a meeting with Putin on the margins of the G20 summit. The Syrian government's ally Russia and Turkey, which back Syrian rebels, agreed in September to create a demilitarized zone around the insurgent-held northwestern enclave of Idlib. But exchanges of shelling have been common since the first airstrike since the deal hit the area on November 25th. British PM Theresa May said that Parliament approving her Brexit deal on December 11 will ensure certainty for the country for the future. May said the summit had given her the opportunity to update leaders on the Brexit deal. She added the international firms based in the UK will benefit from the deal, and the other world leaders said they were keen to sign trade deals with the UK as soon as possible. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe urged British Prime Minister Theresa May to ensure stability as Britain leaves the European Union and asked her to do what she could to avoid a no-deal Brexit. Now, the British Prime Minister secured an agreement with EU leaders on November 25th that would see Britain leave the bloc on March 29, but getting the deal through a deepening divided British Parliament would prove an uphill task for May. US President Donald Trump sat down for meetings with Germany's Angela Merkel, where he said the talks focus on trade. Trump highlighted the trade imbalance between the two countries and said the two leaders will work together to straighten it out. Now, German Chancellor Angela Merkel stressed on talks about WTO as well as Ukrainian crisis and the situation in Syria. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed to hold further talks about events in the Kerch Strait at the advisor level between Ukraine, France and Germany. Russia is resisting international calls to release 3 Ukrainian naval ships that its border patrols fired on and seized in the strait near Russian-annexed Crimea last weekend. Russia accused the 24 sailors of illegally crossing the Russian border, the claim denied by Ukraine. Argentine President Mauricio Macri hosted India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi at his residence outside Buenos Aires for a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit in the capital city. The leaders discussed increasing bilateral cooperation and trade. The meeting took place in the morning before the second day of meetings between world leaders from the group of 20 industrialized nations, which is being hosted by Macri. Veteran leftist Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador was sworn in as Mexican president, promising a radical change, of course, in a country struggling with gang violence, chronic poverty and corruption. The 65-year-old Lopez Obrador took the oath of office in the lower house of Congress, saying his administration would overturn what he called the disastrous legacy of decades of neoliberal governments. Lopez Obrador reiterated that investments in the country of 130 million people would be safe and vowed to respect central bank independence. The doors of Mexico's presidential palace were thrown open to public visitors, fulfilling a promise made by incoming leader Andres Manuel Obrador. A veteran leftist Lopez Obrador has said he will not live at the official residence and will save money by living in an apartment in the presidential palace. Hundreds of people toured the palace, taking a look at the chandeliers, the private libraries, the vast kitchens of Mexico's previous presidents. Obrador has said that the sprawling complex of Los Pinos will now become a cultural center. The world's largest touring performance of Swan Lake is enthralling people in Berlin and stays in the German capital city till December 16. The production features more than 100 dancers in total, as well as hundreds of costumes and elaborate scenery. It has toured the world with stops in Australia and around Europe, including in the Netherlands and Belgium. According to the British choreographer Derek Dean, who cooperated with the Shanghai Ballet for the performance, the large number of dancers requires extra rehearsal time and coordination. After the Berlin run is finished, the production will next take place in Vienna from December 19 to 27. Now, thousands of people took to the streets in Barcelona to protest against austerity measures imposed by the regional government of Catalonia in 2011 that still continue to be in place despite improvements in the economy. Doctors have been on strike since Monday, and on Thursday they were joined by students, civil servants and teachers who demanded that the government of regional president Quim Torra end the cuts. Internally displaced persons living in the Nigerian capital, Abuja, marked World AIDS Day with a play highlighting the dangers of multiple sexual partners, sex for money, and the need for getting regular testing. With the main theme of the event being Know Your Status. Over 100 people also got tested for HIV in the camp. Nigeria has the highest HIV rate in the West and Central Africa, with around 3.5 million people infected with the virus, according to data from the UN AIDS program.